Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. We're coming back at you from Athens, Texas. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that's probably 99% of professing Christendom has no clue about, and that is who are the Israelites and who are the Jews? Is there a difference between Israelites and Jews? Or is it like we are told, and I've been told, and many, many times, and everyone supposedly knows this to be true, that the Jews, the people called the Jews today, that's all 12 tribes of Israel. They're just combined now, they're calling them Jews. Well, ladies and gentlemen, nothing could be farther from the truth, and we're going to be proving that. Now, one thing you need to remember, all Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. As a matter of fact, the Jews make up only just a small percentage of the world's Israelites. Just a tiny percentage of the world's Israelites. Now, let's go back to Abraham. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with Abraham. I could explain the difference between the Jews and the Israelites in 5 minutes. But I'm a teacher. God made me a teacher. He took me out of the cotton fields of Missouri and made me a teacher and gave me a love for completeness. If I start on something, I want to know the background. I want to know what's going on. I want to look to the future if I can. And that's the way I teach. God made me that way, so if it bothers you that I go into so much detail, blame God. Because when He called me out of the cotton fields, I could barely put a sentence together, let alone teach, and I had never done research on anything. Well, that's what I do. That's the way I teach. Now, let's go back to Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. He said, your people will be like the sand of the sea. He said, your descendants will be like the stars in the heavens. You can't number them. A man can't sit and count them, you see. He said, they'll be spread all over the world, and they will become a great and mighty people, even though they are divided into many nations. He said, many nations, peoples and languages and societies will come from your bowels. And at that time, Abraham didn't have one child. And it didn't look like he's ever going to have one. Well, then I'm going to skip, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to leave out much, much more than I tell you, but I'm going to bring you to where I want you to go. And then God promised Abraham, said, there's a land that I'm promising you and your descendants. I'm giving it to your descendants, but I'll let you see it. And that's when he told him, he said, pack up everything, Abraham, and leave your country. He was from Ur of the Chaldees, and he said, leave here. That was a very pagan country. Abraham was a man who worshiped many gods before God got hold of him. And he said, I want you to get out of here. And I'm going to send you to where your descendants will one day return. Well, he took him to the promised land, as you know. And then fast forward, okay, there was Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then the 12 sons of Jacob, and Jacob was renamed Israel by God. And you know the story of Joseph. One of his boys named Joseph, and the others hated him because Jacob loved him so much, and he really didn't do right by the others. He preferred Joseph, and that's not right. We shouldn't do that, but he did. And Joseph had a little mouth problem, and he would tell, well, I had this dream, and you guys bowed down before me. Your mom and dad too, of course. And that really set things off, So one day all the boys except Benjamin was the baby, but the other 10 were out herding sheep. And Jacob, we'll call him Israel. Israel told Joseph, said, go find them, find out how they're getting along. Well, you know the story. They decided to kill him. That's how much they hated him. But they sold him to some people going to Egypt, and you know the story. He wound up in and because he was such a holy man, and everything he did was right, Pharaoh finally put him in charge of his household, or the military man did, and then finally Pharaoh got hold of him, and you know the story. Well, after about probably around more like 300 years or 250 of being in Egypt, the Egyptians made slaves out of them. You see, the Israelites, now we're talking about all 12 tribes now. The Israelites they produced babies. I mean, every 10 months they were producing a baby. They were multiplying greatly, and that was one of their characteristics. And as you recall, Pharaoh got afraid. He said, they're going to out-multiply us. They're going to outnumber us one of these days, and they'll join with some other people and overrun us and take us captive. And anyhow, he was telling him, the midwives, how they needed to kill the boy babies. When they go help the women have the babies, they would kill the boy babies. And the midwife said, he lied to him and said, well, by the time we get there, they've already given birth, you know. Well, how did they get there? Well, there was a famine, and I'm going to go back a little bit now. I jumped ahead a little bit. Going to go back. How did the children of Israel, Jacob and the 69 others, get to Egypt? Well, there was a famine, and remember Jacob or Israel sent the boys, everybody except Benjamin, to Egypt to get the food because Joseph had warned what was coming, you know, about the 7 years of plenty and then the 7 years of drought. And everybody was suffering. And so he sent the boys, Israel sent his boys, and they would go buy food. And of course Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. He had become a man by that time, and probably in splendor like we can't even imagine. He was number 2 man in Egypt. Egypt was the greatest nation on earth at the time. So being number 2 man, you were somebody. There's no telling what he looked like and how he was dressed and everything. And so you know the story, how he played the trick on them. And he jacked with them a little bit, you know, and made them scared them to death. Then he admitted who he was. Of course, they thought, uh-oh, he's going to kill all of us because of what they had done to him, you know. Well, you know the story. God had arranged the whole thing. So he said, well, go get my dad and everybody else. He said, get everybody, all the people of Israel, bring them here. And they did, and okay. And so now we come up to the point where Jacob, this many, many years later, and they had been surviving and thriving in Egypt, multiplying greatly to the point that it scared the Pharaoh. And here's where it gets interesting. What the men would do, the patriarchs would do, is just on their deathbed, or sometime before they died, they would prophesy over their sons. And they'd tell them, by the power of God, they tell them, this is what you're going to be. This is what you're going to be. Talking about character and things like this. And he was very blunt. Israel was very blunt. And he told some of them, he said, you're not worth a dime. He told Reuben, said, you're as unpredictable as water, you know. And sure enough, he went to bed with some of Israel's concubines, you know. But he wasn't a very savory person. But then, now here's an interesting thing. None of these 10 or 11 brothers, none of them brought their sons to be prophesied over. They came themselves. Joseph brought his 2 sons, young guys, probably 4 or 5 years old, to be prophesied over. Why did he do that? God has a way, ladies and gentlemen. God has a way of making things happen. God wanted it to be that way because he had a plan for those two boys. And that plan came out in the words of Israel. And you know how he crossed his hands and all like this. But cutting to the chase, so to speak, he prophesied over Ephraim and Manasseh. That's Joseph's two sons. And he said, from this point on, these boys will carry my name, meaning Israel. Now, of course, the other boys are also Israelites because they were his son, but they were sort of dismissed. But he said, these boys will be known as Israel. So when it speaks of Israel after that, basically he's talking about the descendants of those two boys. The others weren't worth much. But these two boys, he said, they will be Israel. All right, keep that in mind. He said, they will carry my name. And then he said something. He said to Ephraim, he said, you will become, meaning your descendants, will become a company or commonwealth of nations. Now, a commonwealth is when you have one very powerful nation and they control other nations. Control just about everything that goes on in those nations by the power of God. I mean, they were just he said, you're just going to be one nation, but you're going to control all these other nations. Then he prophesied over Manasseh, and he said, you will become a great, singular, great nation, meaning the greatest nation on earth. Well, I'm going to tell you who they are. The only commonwealth of nations that has ever existed on this earth was Britain, or England as we know it. Ephraim's people, once the scattering, we're going to get to the scattering a little bit, they settled in what is called England, or Britain today. And they became a commonwealth of nations. And they went all over the world, establishing colonies. They were colonizing people. And they would go into these places, and the people who were there, Gentiles, which means heathen, they had all these natural resources, but they didn't have the brain power to do anything with them. And the English would go in, they were called English by that time, but they were literally the children or descendants of Ephraim. They'd go in, they'd show them how to get it out of the ground. Or, gold, silver, platinum, copper, diamonds, salt from the sea, all of these things. They showed them how to extract it from the earth like God said. God said, rule the earth. And that's what they were doing. Well, what about Manasseh? Well, Manasseh became the greatest nation this world has ever seen in terms of military, economic, social power. Who's that? There's only been one greatest nation, and that's the United States. No other nation has even come close to our power and authority and dominion. And so these two are brothers. The English and the American, we're brother. We are blood brothers. And for this reason, we kind of joined up, And by 1800, this little island, I don't know, look on a map sometime, see how tiny the little island of England was. And it has Scotland and Ireland. But that's the British Isles, what they call the British Isles. They're nothing, just a dot. And they controlled all of these people in Africa, India, just all over the place. Canada and Australia, New Zealand, all these places, they would go in and extract the good stuff out of the earth and show the people how to do it, and then set it up and hire the people to do the work. But they kept the proceeds. Well, they would pay the people a salary, but they became incredibly rich. By 1800, England was the banking capital of the world. little tiny England, about the size of one of our states. And America, what came known as America, became the most powerful military economic nation on this earth. Single nation. So they got together. At one time, ladies and gentlemen, the United States and England together owned the produce of about 80% of the world's land. We became wealthy. England became incredibly wealthy, you see. But let's go back to what God had told Abraham. He said, I'm going to bless your descendants because you have been so honest and pure, and you've been so obedient to me. I'm going to bless your descendants. However, they've got to obey me to keep that blessing. And if they don't obey me, I will curse them. I'll take it all away from them. I'll destroy them. That's God. God requires us to obey him, or he will, as my dad used to say, he'll take it out of our hide. He will punish to the point of death, if necessary. Well, back to Pharaoh and what happened there. Let's go back to Pharaoh decided that we're going back in history now. Pharaoh decided that he better kill these Israelites and keep them from multiplying. So we wanted to kill all the boy babies. And Moses was one of those babies. The midwives couldn't do it, so he said, we're just going to go kill all the babies under a certain age. Well, you remember the story of Moses. Now they're in Egypt. And he said, we're going to kill them all, and so they did. They killed a bunch of them, but Moses was hidden in a basket in the Nile River. You know the story. Well, he grew up, killed an Egyptian, had to flee, went off into Midian, married this woman, had a couple of boys, and one day, you know, the story of the burning bush. Moses thought he was home free. He thought, well, this is it. You know, this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life, and that's okay. He was shepherding his father-in-law's sheep while his people were back in Egypt, but he couldn't go back because they killed him. There was a warrant out for his arrest. Well, God had other ideas. You know the story, how God sent him back. And he marched into Pharaoh and said, let my people go. He knew those were his people. And you know the story. He said, okay, I'm going to pray, and God's going to send lice and mice and bloody water and hail and all, you know, these plagues that God sent on. And finally Pharaoh had enough, and he said, okay, you can leave. And so Moses, now here's it's interesting here. Moses told the people, he said, if you want to leave here, talking to the Israelites, he said, you must do this thing the night before you leave. He said, God has told me to tell you that you must sacrifice a lamb, what to do with its blood, what to do with the body, how to cook it, how to eat it. Told them they need to be standing up with their staff in their hand. In other words, be ready. And he said, God said, I will tell my death angel to pass over your house if you're doing what I tell you to do. And that's why we call it Passover. And that's what happened that night. He said, now anybody who doesn't do this, their firstborn of both the people and the animals will die that night. Well, they woke up the next morning and all these thousands and thousands of dead people and dead animals because they didn't observe Passover. Well, they left. And you know the story. They got to the Red Sea. God opened the sea, put them through there, killed off the Egyptians. Then they got out into the desert past the Red Sea. And God spoke to them through Moses, and he said, and he had a specific day. He said, this day is the first day of your year. And it's been that way ever since. It was about the time we, not we, I don't, but that the church celebrates Easter. It was about that time. And he said, I want you to count 14 days from this day, and I want you to celebrate Passover. Celebrate what you just did over here in Egypt. And he said, you'll do this forever, celebrating Passover. That includes today, folks. Now here's an interesting thing. If you go to Exodus 12th chapter, verse 38, it says in Exodus 12:38, and a mixed multitude left Egypt with Israel. They were with Israel. He's not counting Israel now. He said there was a mixed multitude who came out with them. Who were these people? Well, they were Gentiles. They were heathen people. What made them come out? Well, they saw what God had done to the Egyptians. He said, hey, we see this going on. These people, nothing's happening to them, the Israelites. Their God has done all this. We're going with their God, which I thought was pretty wise. Now, these people, probably some of them were Egyptians, some of them were probably slaves. The Egyptians at that time were the mightiest nation on earth, and they would go conquer a nation, they'd bring slaves back. And there's probably a lot of those slaves that decided, I'm going with these people. Well, here's what God said when he brought them out. Now remember, a multitude, a mixed, in other words, various races of people came out with them. They became one with the Israelites. God said, all of you have to observe the Passover. Well, remember back in Egypt, God said, if you're going out, you've got to observe Passover. They had observed Passover back in Egypt. Otherwise, they couldn't have come out. God wouldn't have let them come out. So they were already observing Passover, just like the Israelites. That was the first time the Israelites did it, and they did it too, this mixed multitude. And then God said to them, one law will govern everybody. Everybody in this big congregation, there's 12 tribes of Israel, and these heathen Gentiles. And these Gentiles, remember, there's not a tribe of Gentiles. We never hear anything about that. These people were absorbed by the 12 tribes of Israel. They absorbed them, they welcomed them in, they probably intermarried with them, and they became spiritual Israelites. Not physical Israelites. They'll always be, and their descendants would always be Gentiles. But they adopted the God of the Israelites and his law, and God said, you got to obey this law. And so they became spiritual Israelites. But ladies and gentlemen, nothing has changed. If you are going, no matter who you are, if you are going to become God's child, you must become a spiritual Israelite and obey that one law. And remember, he gave them that law on Mount Sinai about 2 weeks later. He said, one law will govern all of you forever. And he gave it to them on Mount Sinai. Okay, fast forward many, many years, many generations. And the people, you know, God was governing them by prophets. And Samuel was a great prophet, and the people feared him because they knew if they didn't do right, Samuel would set God on them, you know. And but the people said, no, we want a king. We want to be like the heathen out here that we are among. And so God said, okay, and he gave them Saul, and you know that was a disaster. And then he gave them David, King David. David then drew all of the tribes together. They'd have this faction, this group over here, and this over here. David drew them all together and made one nation. It became the mightiest nation on the earth. at that time. Now, David died, and I'm really skipping a lot of stuff, but David died, and Solomon, his son, became king. Well, Solomon, as you know, created the greatest. He outwent David. The nation became even bigger, even stronger, even more powerful, even more luxurious. How did he do that? Taxation. He taxed the people unmercifully. Well, when he died, his son Rehoboam took over. This was a monarchy handed down to the eldest son. And okay, now here's where we get into the Jews Israelite difference. Now, the nation was kind of a two-parter. You had the southern, what they call the southern tribes in Judea, and they were Judah and Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin have always been together. And then you had the other 10 tribes down in the up in the northern part, and it's called Samaria. The area called Samaria. But they were all one nation. This is Israel. Well, the people of Samaria sent a contingent in to Rehoboam and said, look, your father taxed us really too much, and if you will lower the taxes on us, we will serve you forever. And Rehoboam was a kind of a toad, I guess you'd say. And he said, not only am I going to tax you like my dad did, said, I'm going to tax you even more. And they said, no, you're not. We're leaving. And so the 10 tribes left and became separate. Now you've got the Judahites, that's what they were called in the Hebrew, Judahites. Now, where'd the word Jew come from? The King James interpreters nicknamed these people Jews. That's not really a biblical word. That's an English word. It's a nickname for the Judahites, the people of Judah and Benjamin. And these people down here in Samaria, they left. They said, we're not paying any more taxes to you. We're not coming to Jerusalem to worship the temple. We're going to do things our own way down here. We establish our own temples down here. And that's not good. God never intended that. But they separated, and then because they established other temples and started worshiping heathen gods, the priestly tribe, the Levites, that were scattered among all of the tribes as their spiritual leaders, left the other 9, and came back to Jerusalem, to the Judahites. And so now you've got Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Those 3 tribes are now the southern tribes. And the northern tribes are the other 9. Actually, there are 10 because Joseph's 2 sons created two tribes. Okay, so you actually wind up with 13 tribes. Now, the first time that the word Jew is used in the Bible, the Jews were at war with Israel. They're different. The Jews were at war with Israel. The people down here in Samaria, they called themselves Israel. You got the Jews, or the Judahites, and the Israelites. Now they're all Israelites, but they've just, it's kind of like the United States when we had the Civil War. You had the Confederacy, but they were all Americans, you see. So all 12 tribes, or 13 tribes, are Israelites, but only those 3 are Jews to this day. All these others are Israelites to this day. So you got 3 out of 13 tribes are called Jews. Ask yourself this question. where are they today? We know where the Jews are because they're so different, and they call themselves Jews. But what happened to the other tribes? What happened to the other probably 90% of the Israelites? What happened to them? Well, I'm going to tell you. Now, if you want to know where the first time the word Jew is used in the Bible, where they are at war with Israel, go to 2 Chronicles 16, chapter 16, verse 1, and it says the Jews were at war with Israel. Two different groups of people now. Now, so you've got the Judahites, or the Jews up here. Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Then you've got the other 10 tribes down here, or up here, up north. That's very hard for me because I've been there, and it seems like it ought to be reversed. Because they say we go up to Judah. Actually, they go down to Judah, to Jerusalem. Israel became these 10 tribes down here. They became very wicked under the leadership of Jeroboam. He was one of the most wicked, and his descendants handed down the kingship, and they were the most wicked people that I guess had ever led Israel. And remember, when I say Israel, I'm talking about the northern tribes. When I say Jews, I'm talking about the 3 southern tribes. Now, God began to warn Israel through his prophets. And he said that they would tell them, God said, if you don't get right with him and turn from your wicked ways, he's going to destroy you. They didn't believe him. So in approximately 720, now when I give you a date like this as to when Israel fell, this happened over several years. So between, say, 718 and 722, something like this, that's when it all took place. It took some time. So I just say 720, which is about in the middle. God raised up, that's in the Bible, he raised up Assyria to attack, to overcome, destroy thousands upon thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them, and those that were left were captured and taken to Assyria as slaves. Now, do you remember, here comes Jesus later, do you remember what Jesus told the disciples to do? He said, when he sent them out, he said, don't bother with the Jews. He taught the Jews. He said, don't bother with the people in Samaria, because by this time, all the Israelites had been taken out of Samaria, and Samaria had been filled with heathen. That's what the Assyrians would do. They would go conquer a country. They'd take those people out, put them somewhere else, and put in different people in their country. Well, that's what happened in Samaria, where the other tribes lived. And these were heathen people. And there's some interesting stories that I'll get to later on these people. But remember what Jesus told, well, by this time he called them apostles. He said, don't stay here and don't go in Samaria. He said, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. By this time they were called the house of Judah and the house of Israel. Well, the house of Israel, way down here. You see, when the Assyrians captured them, not long after that, Babylon attacked Assyria and all of the tribes, they scattered, went all over the world. And when they left, they could go wherever they wanted to go. And when they left, they left as a group. In other words, this tribe would go this way, this tribe would go this way, this tribe would go this way. And God said to the apostles, said, you go and find these people and tell them about me. This is what Jesus said. You go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he used the word lost because to the world they were lost. Why? Because they had gone into these Gentile countries And over generation after generation, they intermingled with them and became just like the Gentiles. They lost their identity, they lost their language, they lost their religion, they lost everything and became as those people. So those that went to the area now called France, they became French people. Those that went to the area called Sweden, they became Swedish people to this day. And they don't know who they are. They just know something about the Old Testament God. Why? Because the apostles found them and told them about that. Now, where do they go? Where did these tribes go when they were scattered everywhere? Well, people much smarter than I, and people who have access to this kind of information, have searched through records for many, many years, and they've come up with where these people went. Now, the list I'm going to read to you is from the Scottish Declaration of Independence, and you can find this in Edinburgh, Scotland, and in a book titled Sacred Fire by Peter Lilbach. And they have done this research, and here's where these people went. The tribe of Dan settled in what is today Denmark. And what I'm going to do, just tell you the tribal name, where they settled, and who they are today. In other words, the tribe of Dan is now a Danish people. Those people of the tribe of Dan, their descendants are called Danes. They're Danish. They speak the language. They have the Danish religion, which is what? Christianity. Or what they call Christianity. Or where did they get that? From the apostles. The apostles went to them and told them, and they accepted it. And they became, as God said, lights to the Gentile. He said, these scattered tribes will become light, my lights to the Gentiles. Well, they did. And they've converted whole nations to their version, their polluted version of Christianity, which is what we have today. Benjamin became the people of Iceland. Interesting thing about Iceland. A man, and I have his name somewhere, but he went to Iceland not too long ago, back in the 80s, I believe. And he told these people, he said, you are the descendants of the tribe of Benjamin. And they didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that they were Jews, that are what, part of that Jewish inheritance. They didn't believe it. He came back later with proof. And the people of Iceland, their government agreed with him and put it in writing that they are the children of Benjamin. They agree with him. They admit it. You see, nobody wants to be called a Jew. The world hates Jews. Well, the people that are hating the Jews are Israelites. Isn't that amazing? Well, that's what happens when Satan gets hold of you. Asher became Sweden. Naphtali went to Norway and became Norwegians, and are to this day. Remember, these people are still their descendants to this day. They don't know they're Israelites. They don't have a clue. Issachar went to Finland. Judah, first, remember, Judah was captured and taken off to Babylon many years later after Israel. Well, they came back, and back into Judea, and everywhere else. Let me just tell you, about 150 years after God destroyed and scattered Israel, he did the same thing to Judah, the Jews. And 42,000 of them came back after 70 years and rebuilt Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple, and resettled the area. Zebulun became French. Gad became Italian. Reuben became Holland. Simeon became Spain. Ephraim became Britain, the English, the Commonwealth of England. Manasseh became America, the United States. Now, that's where the lost tribes of Israel are. They became known as the lost tribes of Israel. But because the apostles went and visited them and introduced them to Christianity, which they very quickly polluted, but anyhow, they know about God. Remember what Jesus said that just kind of makes people's blood boil? He said, salvation is of the Jews. And the church literally almost fumes because of that. Salvation, this is Jesus Christ talking, salvation, he said, is of the Jews. Wait a minute, the Jews don't even believe in Jesus. And if you don't believe in Jesus, how can salvation be from these people? Well, it's because they kept the law. What people don't understand is, in order to be saved, you've got to keep the law. Who keeps the law? The Jews. So Jesus said, you got to keep the law. The Jews have the law. Therefore, salvation is of the Jews. Then we had World War II. And you know what happened to the Jews. People have wondered why the world hates the Jews. It wasn't because they killed Jesus. Most of the world couldn't care less about Jesus. Never heard of him. Many of them never heard of him. But they hate Jews. Why? Because they're sinful people. They were sinners long before Jesus came along. They were even worse than the Israelites, their brethren. And they got scattered all over the world. You remember when Jesus and the disciples came out of the temple, and the disciples were showing him, Lord, look at all these beautiful stones and things like this. And Jesus said, let me tell you something. He said, there will come a time when not one stone will be left on another. And this was approximately 31 AD. Not one stone will be left on another. The walls of Jerusalem will come down, the temple will come down, everything will be leveled. That happened in 70 AD, when the Romans under General Titus attacked and killed hundreds of thousands of them. Why? Sin. General Titus said in a letter, and I have read the letter, not the exact letter, of course, but I've read what he said in the letter. He said, I did not want to slaughter the Jews. I didn't want to do that. But their God, listen to what he said, their God told me that I must do this. He admitted that the Jews' God was the true God, and that the Jews' God told him he had to kill the Jews. He killed hundreds of thousands, and they sold them, this is the Roman army, and they sold them into slavery. And this is how the Jews got scattered all over the world, just like the Israelites, their brethren, the other 10 tribes. Now, God left some signs for us. They said, when you see these signs, you know, as the signs come and go, you know that my second coming is near. One of the signs is that Judah, or what they call Israelites, it's called the state of Israel. It really isn't. It's the state of Judah, because it's just Jews there. They will again have their own nation, because that nation has to be destroyed. And ladies and gentlemen, it has to be destroyed along with the United States and Britain, because we've done exactly the same thing, and we are exactly what God said we are as nations. We are godless. Well, we have a God. It's Satan. We are sinners to the core. We lead the world in sin and degradation and evilness. And we do it under the name of Jesus. We call ourselves God's people. Wear crosses around our necks. It's hypocrisy. And God's going to destroy us, because he said that he would. Remember what he told Abraham? He said, I'm going to bless them, but in order to maintain that blessing, they got to obey me. and we've done everything but. Now, during World War II, and you know all about the Holocaust and things like this, approximately 70% of all the Jews on the earth were killed during the Holocaust. 70%. That's why there aren't many Jews today. Today there are only about 15 million Jews worldwide. And people believe that that constitutes all 13 tribes of Israel? No, it doesn't. The reason people believe that's because they don't know who the Israelites are. They don't know who the lost tribes of Israel are. And the lost tribes don't know who they are. Well, people like me are telling them. And they're not buying it. You tell somebody out here in one of these churches, you're actually an Israelite, they're not going to like it because they don't want anything to do with that. But that's just the way it is. He said, go to the lost tribes. Make them Christian nations. You know, God told Abraham, he said, your descendants will make many nations, said you'll be the father of many nations. Well, I just read a list of nations that are peopled by Abraham's descendants. He said your numbers will be like the sand of the sea. Well, try counting all those people. Hundreds of millions of Israelites in these nations. God said, in the last days, I will hold them to account if they don't obey me, and we haven't. Ladies and gentlemen, hell is about to come here in England and in what's called Israel and all the nations that are called Christian nations. All hell is about to break loose. God is going to pour out his wrath on all of us. He said, you have sown the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind, and it's coming. You better get ready for it. Well, how do you do that? You must leave all the religion. I don't care what religion you're in. I don't care whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Hindu or Muslim. Get out of that. Come and follow the God of this word. Because if you do, you will be saved from all of that. God will take his people, he said, to a place of safety. And he will protect them there for the 3.5 years when hell is going to break loose like this world has never seen. He said all the catastrophes and the horrors that have gone on before, all of them combined will not compare to this that's coming. Ladies and gentlemen, get right with God. And if you need any information, write to me. You can go down at the bottom, down below this film, and write to me. I'll send you any information I've got. You've got to get right with God. Until next time, study the Word of God.